The storm arrived without warning. In a matter of minutes, thunder, lightning, and rain that seemed to be throwing the sky down lashed the town. However, their footsteps could be heard on the roof stronger than the tempest itself. They were not slow or cautious steps lurking. On the contrary, they were felt with great force. They were there, jumping on our roof, beating our windows. And there was not just one, but two, and they wanted to come in. I close my eyes and the memories of that night are vivid, sitting on the floor, numbed by the fear, the terror, and the greatest horror a child can experience at 11 years old. I covered my ears with my hands, trying not to hear them, and prayed. I prayed all the prayers my mother taught me so they would not enter again. I did not want to look either, but every time they entered, I would open my eyes to observe what was happening around me. I remember seeing my mother crying, desperate, holding the entrance door and with her back to it, holding a piece of furniture that would prevent their entry like a barricade. My older brother, hammer in hand, was nailing huge boards to the window. Everything served to protect us that night. Their faces reflected an indescribable fear. My mother was crying, launching heart-rending screams that I could not stop hearing even by covering my ears. The thunder was increasingly intense. Each lightning bolt was the prelude to the sky's rumblings that shook the entire house's windows. My father had been outside for several minutes, armed only with his hunting shotgun and a crucifix, chasing those things, those horrible things that were trying to take my little brother. Until before that night, witches for me were only legends, myths, and part of hundreds of stories that were told and traveled from town to town for generations. They were also often an effective method to scare us when we disobeyed our parents. I could never have imagined that that Christmas I would discover the truth, that they do exist, that they are as real as evil itself, and that one must fear them. One must fear and pray when speaking about them, or when someone claims to have seen them. The days before Christmas were strange. There was a different atmosphere. It was clearly the prelude to what would happen in the town those days, and the experience we would live with my family. People were commenting on rumors about strange apparitions, nighttime appearances that certain people were perceiving, shadows wandering across rooftops, enormous birds circling houses. All of this was part of the rumors that ran from mouth to mouth. There was also an excessive barking of dogs almost every night, which lasted for long hours. Don Carlos, owner of one of the town's most popular stores, was where these rumors arrived and were heard. One day when we went shopping at his store, he told us that Mrs. Marta was saying that for several nights she had been spotting witches, stalking and jumping across house roofs, paying more attention to families with small newborns. Mrs. Marta was an elderly woman of advanced age who lived in an enormous house, on a corner with several meters of land and one of the oldest in the town. Her location gave her an excellent view of the community where we resided, right in front, where the largest number of homes and families in the area were grouped. At her age, she barely slept anymore. She said that just a couple of hours of sleep were enough for her. Therefore, she had plenty of time, both at night and in the early morning, for her investigations and to observe what was happening in the town. This gave her the reputation of being a gossip, as she spent her time telling stories, creating or inventing intrigues. Many also thought that due to her advanced age, she was already experiencing mental problems. That is why, and for the above reasons, they did not give much credit to her comments and the supposed witch appearances in the town that she mentioned. A grave error, we should have believed her. As the days passed, Mrs. Marta's obsession with the witches increased to such a point that she would wait for families with babies or small children at their house doors, or visit businesses and main avenues of the town to encounter them, and warn them about these apparitions. Bible and rosary in hand, she began to daily walk the streets, transforming into a kind of preacher, presaging the arrival of these supposed witches. And she would tell us that we must pray, and protect our children. By chance one morning, while out shopping, my mother, my newborn brother, and I encountered her. We were circulating along one of the main streets when she suddenly appeared, turning a corner. Upon seeing us, she accelerated her steps, despite coming directly towards us, and our encounter being almost inevitable. The speed with which she walked to approach us caused me some fear, as although I knew her, I had never seen her in such an accelerated state. As soon as she stopped in front of us, she directed all her attention to the carriage where my little brother was. She mumbled a kind of blessing and then made the sign of the cross in front of him. Then she addressed my mother. "Is he baptized?" she asked without beating around the bush or taking her eyes off the baby. "Not yet, Mrs. Marta. We will do it soon," my mother answered with a bit of annoyance at the intrusion. "Do it now, before it's too late. They are already here. I've seen them at night, roaming the houses, above the roofs, walking, flying like turkeys searching for newborn babies to suck, to extract their life. Last night they were on your roof. There were two. I clearly saw them. They remained there for several minutes, crouched silent, looking for a way to enter." Hearing her was like a bucket of cold water. My blood froze, and I was horrified in such a way that I instinctively hugged my mother. And I think she also felt fear. In a second, she turned pale, and her only reaction was to turn around and walk quickly toward the house. Mrs. Marta began to follow us, shouting, insisting, "Close all your doors and windows, stay together at night, take care of the baby, place an open pair of scissors on his little bed, and pray." We accelerated our pace even more, and after a few blocks we finally lost sight of her. No, of course, without being left with the worry of her words. That night, after such a sinister episode, I could not sleep. I would close my eyes and see Mrs. Marta repeating each word about those witches. I was terribly afraid. I could not believe that on the eve of Christmas, my thoughts were of these witches, and not the anticipation of Christmas Eve. Dining and opening gifts around the Christmas tree with my family. Just imagining what it would be like to see or feel one of those things nearby did not let me sleep. I was so afraid that I went to my older brother's room to ask to sleep with him that night. I thought that way I would feel a bit more protected and could fall asleep. I don't remember the exact time, but the neighbor's dog began to bark desperately and suddenly woke me up. The barking lasted for several minutes, almost an hour, but what truly unnerved me was that suddenly, it stopped. It ceased barking out of nowhere, after a painful yelp from the animal, as if someone had struck and scolded it. That abrupt silence I had been waiting for to reconcile my sleep gave way to something much worse. It was in that silence that I first felt it. And then I saw them. They were there, on our neighbor's roof. They were somewhat clumsy, making too much noise while climbing. Not yet knowing what these witches were, I got up and looked out the window at the disturbing noise. The bedroom window faced the side of our neighbor's land, and it was dark. The street lighting was weak and did not reach with force along the side and yard of the houses. I pulled back the curtain and took a general look, seeing nothing unusual, and then I looked toward the roof. There they were, crouching, staring at me intently for several seconds already, as if waiting for me, as if knowing I would join them. I quickly closed the curtain, horrified. My heart began to beat 1,000 times per hour. A shiver ran through my entire body, ending with me urinating from indescribable terror. I moved my brother, trying to wake him. I wanted to tell him what was out there, but words would not come out of my mouth. I could only move and shake him. But he got angry and scolded me in the midst of his heavy sleep. "Go to sleep. It's not time to be bothering me." I ran to my parents' room. The fear was such that I could not even cry. I opened the door with a bang, which woke them, and they looked at me, stunned and scared, asking what was wrong. Motionless in the doorway, I burst into tears. My mother ran to hug me and asked again what was happening. The witches are outside." I repeated it over and over. My father joined the embrace, kissed me on the cheek, trying to calm me. Then they took me to the bathroom to clean me up and change my soaked pajamas. A while later, I found myself in my parents' bed, protected, insisting that it had only been a nightmare and wishing with all my might that it had been just that. What happened the next day was not a coincidence. A horrific event with which the town awoke. A small baby, approximately 1 year old, from a family living a few blocks from our house, had died. Apparently, he had died of respiratory failure. The news left the entire community stunned. It was a new family in the town, and perhaps that's why no one wanted to ask too many questions. And out of respect for the pain they were experiencing, of course. Despite this, rumors began to circulate everywhere that the baby had been a victim of witches, that he had appeared dead outside his room, with no explanation. Bluish, suffocated. They said he had been sucked. To make matters worse, we saw our neighbor burying his dog in the morning. By this point, there was a kind of generalized panic in the town. Many firmly believed that the witches had been responsible for the baby's death, and began to shelter their children and families early in their houses, closing doors and windows with greater security. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the community looked like a ghost town. No one wanted to be on the street when darkness arrived. The winter climate meant night fell earlier than usual. As if all this were not enough, suddenly Mrs. Martha appeared in front of our house. Bible in hand, she persisted in her prayers and did not cease repeating that the witches would come that night, that they would not stop until they devoured all the babies in the town, that they needed to rejuvenate, and that they would suck the babies through their fontanelles with their enormous turkey-like beaks, that we should not leave them alone for a second at night, and that we should pray. The storm fell without warning, which drove Mrs. Martha away. In a matter of minutes, the sky turned black. Wind and lightning announced a great storm. After the episode with Mrs. Martha, my parents remained reflecting on the matter, on what was happening. Too many inexplicable things had happened in so few days, and I think they began to believe in this witch story. There were too many coincidences. It was just a matter of connecting the pieces, and everything transformed into something almost believable. In a few hours, the rain gave way to a storm. The thunder split the sky. It was the worst weather we could have on Christmas Eve. Clearly, it was not what we expected for Christmas. With nothing else to do, we prepared to rest. We closed the doors and windows more securely than usual and went to our rooms. I asked my parents to sleep with them, and they agreed. I think deep down they felt as much fear as I did. My little brother in his crib was finishing his milk, and my mother was cuddling him to help him fall asleep. My father, for his part, was trying to distract himself by watching television, and I was slowly falling into a deep sleep. I had hardly slept the previous night because of the witches. Horrible screams, heart-wrenching crying, wind, rain entering the room. That was what woke me up, and that was the landscape I found when I opened my eyes. Scenes that would be forever etched in my life. Terrifying moments that would mark my childhood. To the point that today, 20 years later, I remember every moment as if it were yesterday. I could tell it hundreds of times, with the same wealth of details. I think no one could forget something like this. The scene. My father, crucifix in hand, protecting my mother with his body, and she was there behind, motionless, terrified, clinging to my father's arm, almost fainting. The scene I saw completely disoriented me. Both were directing their attention toward the window. I sat up scared in bed quickly and had to react suddenly to what I was seeing. I looked at the window, but I had to move a bit to observe clearly because my parents were blocking my view. What I saw was simply the most hideous, terrifying, traumatizing image anyone could observe in their life. They were there. The witches. Not one, but two. Horrible and disgusting. Just a few meters from us. I rubbed my eyes for a few seconds, as if wanting to wake up, wishing I had seen wrong, wishing it was all just an illusion. But no, there they were, both at the foot of the window, which was wide open. The storm wind was entering through that window, bringing with it all its fury, wetting the room. These horrible creatures wore no clothing, but with the wind, the curtains behind them seemed to dress them ominously. Their bodies were completely naked, old and bony. They looked like two completely naked, malnourished elderly women. Their hunched, semi-crouched posture, almost with humps, gave them a demonic, sinister appearance. Their skin looked grayish, with deformities and protuberances on all their limbs. Their faces showed a demonic smile, almost mocking, with pleasure in what they were doing. Their hair was very long, gray, almost white, and mistreated. Both disgusting creatures were soaked by the rain, which gave them an even more sinister appearance. One of them was protecting the other, just as my father was protecting my mother. I did not clearly understand everything that was happening, everything occurring in the room, until I looked more carefully at the scene, completely awake and my senses activated. Then I saw it. My little brother, my small brother, was hanging from the hand of that disgusting witch, the one in back. She was holding him by one of his little feet as if he were prey, about to take him to be devoured, hiding him. The noise of the storm silenced his desperate cry, but not my mother's. My mother's screams of pain were so horrible and shocking, begging these things to return her baby, that not even the strongest thunder could silence them. After a few moments, my older brother entered the room with my father's shotgun and quickly handed it to him, and he pointed it at the witches. They began to slowly retreat, sensing the threat, and escaped through the window, taking my brother with them. My father did not hesitate for a second and fired. The impact was direct, and the witch's scream of pain was deafening. Her screams mixed with my mother's, my father's, my brother's, and mine. That room was hell itself for a few seconds. The shot hitting the witch's body was not enough to prevent them from fleeing through the window. My father, in a desperate and heroic act, followed her. He was not going to allow them to take my brother that night. By instinct, we wanted to follow my father, but he quickly shouted at us to stay inside, to close the entire house. We remained perplexed by the window for some minutes, our pain tearing us apart, in suffering. But there was no time for laments. Those things, those disgusting witches were out there in the yard, with my dad trying to prevent them from taking our baby, and they could try to enter again. We had to obey my father and take shelter in the house. My brother quickly placed a huge piece of furniture to block the main door and then took the toolbox and began nailing the windows shut. My mother did not stop crying while protecting the entrance. That inconsolable crying is something I will never, ever be able to forget. We heard several shots. Those witches were wounded, or at least one of them. We heard them through the walls, climbing to go up to the roof again, and above we could hear their heavy and clumsy footsteps, as if trying to rip something apart. More shots, more horrible and shocking screams from the witches. It hurt them. In seconds, the conflict seemed to move to the backyard, where an infernal scandal could be heard, as if they were destroying everything in their path or were unable to flee normally due to their injuries. We were very afraid. It was my dad who was dealing with these things, and we could lose him. We could lose my brother forever. We prayed. We just prayed nonstop, even more so when we stopped hearing that noise from outside. When there was a deathly silence, where only the rain could be felt. A silence that left us waiting for an end we did not know would be good or bad. Only a few minutes passed, but it seemed like an eternity. The silence was broken when someone knocked on the door forcefully and insistently, almost breaking it down. Startled, we thought it was the witches, but it was my father. We heard his voice behind the door, along with my little brother's crying, which brought our soul back to our body. We moved the furniture desperately and opened it for them to enter. The cry of pain turned into a cry of happiness, of hope. The image of my father with my little brother in his arms, soaked by the tempest, was the best image and gift we could have had that Christmas. My older brother quickly ran for towels and blankets to dry them and give them warmth. My little brother would not stop crying while my mother dried him and checked him for any injuries, to see if those witches had managed to do anything to him. She quickly checked his head and fontanelle. Thank God he had no injury at all. My father, exhausted, bloodied, left the shotgun propped against the sofa and sat down with his hands on his head. He was still trembling, but more than from the cold, I think it was from fear. From a fear that survived fighting these horrible things and snatching them away from my brother. In a matter of seconds, he began to cry. He had been holding in all the suffering from that horrible and traumatizing experience. We ran to hug him, to console him, to give him infinite thanks. He was our hero, and we will never, ever forget what he did for us that night. 20 years have passed, and we still live in the same house, in the same town. The experience gave us more strength instead of frightening us. The town is clearly not the same. The urbanization expanded. Modernization gave way to new businesses and supermarkets. Mrs. Martha no longer exists, nor do her gossips. But what continues to exist, whether we believe in them or not, are the witches. I did not believe in them. Many people do not believe in them, but the truth is that they are there, lurking, waiting. Perhaps they continue to visit other towns, other homes, waiting for some carelessness and the opportunity to take our babies. Although we have heard only a few rumors and stories of apparitions during these long years, the truth is that there has never been another concrete incident of an attack by these witches in our town. But I know they are there, somewhere nearby, hidden, waiting for us to stop believing in them and for us to become careless, thinking they are just a myth, a legend.